The evening air was heavy with the scent of rain, the kind of rain that brings a hush over the world. I sat in my wheelchair by the window, watching the sky turn a dark shade of gray. The old farmhouse where Grandma and I lived was surrounded by fields that stretched as far as the eye could see, a perfect place to disappear from the world. At least, that's what I'd always thought. Grandma Atkins, with her silver hair tied neatly into a bun and her hands always busy with some task or another, was the center of my universe. We'd lived alone for as long as I could remember, ever since my mother, Marguerite, left us. The pain of her departure was something neither of us talked about, but it lingered in the air like a ghost, always present but never acknowledged. I was born with legs that refused to work properly, a twisted gift from a father I never knew. Grandma said I was a miracle, that God had given me a sharp mind to make up for my broken body. She was the one who taught me to read, to write, and to think for myself. She was my world, and I was hers. But that night, something felt off. The usual sounds of the countryside, the crickets chirping, the wind rustling through the trees, were absent. There was a stillness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I wheeled myself away from the window and into the kitchen, where Grandma was washing dishes, her back turned to me. "Edward, come help me dry these," she said without looking up. She always knew when I was near. As I reached for the dish towel, I heard it, a soft creak from the front porch. My heart skipped a beat. We rarely had visitors, especially not at this hour. I looked at Grandma, and she must have seen the fear in my eyes because she dried her hands and walked to the door. Who could it be at this time of night? She murmured, more to herself than to me. The knock that followed was polite, almost too polite. It didn't match the unease that had settled in my stomach. Grandma hesitated for a moment before opening the door. Standing there were two men, their faces hidden under the shadows of their hats. One was tall and lanky, the other short and stocky. They didn't look like they belonged in a quiet village like ours. "Evening, ma'am," the taller one said, tipping his hat slightly. "We're looking for a place to stay for the night. Got a room to spare?" Grandma glanced back at me. I could see the conflict in her eyes, her natural kindness battling with the instinct to protect. But before she could answer, the shorter man stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he took in our modest home. "Looks like you're alone out here," he said, his voice gruff. "Just you and the boy?" I knew then that they weren't just travelers looking for shelter. There was something predatory in their gaze, something that sent a chill down my spine. Grandma took a step back, her hand tightening around the doorknob. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "We don't have any space to offer. You should try the inn in the next town over." The tall man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We insist, ma'am. We're not leaving until we get what we came for." Before I could react, the shorter man pushed past Grandma, forcing his way into the house. The door slammed shut behind him, and I felt a wave of panic wash over me. I wheeled myself backward, but the tall man grabbed the handles of my chair, stopping me in my tracks. Now, he said, his voice smooth and menacing. "Let's not make this difficult." Grandma tried to reach for the phone, but the shorter man was faster. He yanked it off the wall and smashed it against the floor. The sound echoed through the house, loud and final. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice trembling. The tall man leaned down, his face inches from mine. His breath smelled of tobacco and something sour. "Just a little something to help us on our way. Money, valuables, anything you've got." Grandma stepped forward, her hands clenched into fists. "We don't have much. Just take what you need and leave us alone." The shorter man laughed, a harsh, cruel sound. "Oh, we'll be taking what we want, all right. And if you cooperate, no one has to get hurt." But I knew better. I'd seen the look in their eyes. They weren't just here for money. They were here because they thought we were easy prey, an old woman and a crippled boy, living alone in the middle of nowhere. They were wrong. As the men started rummaging through our home, tearing through drawers and cabinets, I caught Grandma's eye. There was a silent understanding between us. She nodded, just slightly, and I knew what I had to do. Quietly, I wheeled myself down the hall, towards the room that had once been my mother's. Hanging on the wall was an old rifle, dusty and forgotten. It had belonged to Grandpa Atkins, a relic from a time when men had to defend their homes with their own hands. I reached for it, my fingers trembling. The metal was cold and heavy, but it felt right in my hands. I didn't know if I could fire it, didn't know if I had the strength. But I knew I had to try. The sound of the men's voices grew louder as they argued over the few valuables they'd found. I positioned myself in the doorway, the rifle aimed at the taller man's back. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. "Leave," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. They didn't hear me. I said, "Leave." This time, they both turned to look at me. The tall man's eyes widened as he saw the rifle, but the shorter one just sneered. "You're not gonna shoot us, kid," he said, taking a step toward me. "You don't have it in you." But he was wrong. I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting for Grandma, for the life we'd built together. And I wasn't about to let these men take that away. I pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot was deafening, the recoil nearly knocking me out of my chair. The tall man crumpled to the floor, clutching his neck as blood pooled around him. The shorter man froze, his eyes wide with shock. For a moment, everything was still. Then the shorter man bolted for the door, leaving his partner behind. I heard the screen door slam shut and the sound of footsteps fading into the distance. I lowered the rifle, my hands shaking. The tall man was still, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. I'd never seen a dead body before, and the sight of it made my stomach turn. Grandma was at my side in an instant, her hands gripping my shoulders. "Edward, are you all right?" I nodded, but I wasn't sure if I was telling the truth. The weight of what I'd done was starting to sink in, and I felt like I might collapse under it. "We need to call the police," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "But first, let's get you out of here." She wheeled me back into the living room, away from the gruesome scene. I could hear the neighbor's dog barking in the distance, the only sign that the outside world hadn't stopped along with my heart. As I sat there, the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a deep, bone-chilling fear. What had I just done? What was going to happen to us now? But I didn't have time to dwell on those thoughts. The sound of a siren in the distance told me that the nightmare was far from over. The following days passed in a blur of police interviews, whispers from neighbors, and sleepless nights. The farmhouse that had once been a place of peace now felt tainted, haunted by the memory of what had happened. I could still see the man's lifeless eyes every time I closed mine, and the weight of the rifle in my hands was a sensation I couldn't shake. The police had come and gone, their questions relentless. They'd taken the body away, leaving only a dark stain on the floor as a reminder of that terrible night. The other man, Amos, they said his name was, had been caught trying to flee the village. He was in custody now, awaiting trial. But the threat he represented felt far from over. Grandma tried to keep things normal, but I could see the strain in her every movement. She was aging faster, her steps slower, her hands more tremulous than before. I knew she blamed herself for what had happened, even though it wasn't her fault. We were just two people caught in a nightmare that had descended on us without warning. It was late one evening when the doorbell rang. Grandma had been resting in her room, and I was left to answer it. A young woman stood on our porch, her features obscured by the twilight. She looked familiar, though I couldn't place her face. "Edward Atkins?" she asked, her voice soft and hesitant. "Yes, that's me. Can I help you?" She stepped closer, and as the light from the hallway illuminated her face, recognition hit me like a punch to the gut. It was my mother, Marguerite. I hadn't seen her in years. The last memory I had of her was blurry, a mix of anger and sorrow. She'd left when I was still a child, too young to understand why, but old enough to feel the sting of abandonment. And now, here she was, standing on our porch as if no time had passed at all. "Edward. I'm so sorry," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. I wanted to speak, but no words came out. My throat felt tight, and all the emotions I'd buried over the years came rushing to the surface. Anger, hurt, confusion, it was all there, swirling inside me. Why now? I finally managed to say, my voice barely more than a whisper. She looked down, unable to meet my gaze. I heard what happened. I needed to see you, to make sure you were all right. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to slam the door in her face, to tell her she had no right to come back after all this time. But another part, a small, vulnerable part, wanted to believe that she was here because she cared. Grandma's inside, I said, my voice flat. You should talk to her. She hesitated, then nodded. I wheeled myself back, allowing her to step inside. The house felt colder with her presence, as if the ghosts of the past had come alive with her arrival. I watched as she made her way down the hall, her steps slow and unsure. When she reached Grandma's door, she paused, taking a deep breath before knocking. "Mother?" she called out, her voice trembling. Grandma opened the door, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. They just stood there, two women with a lifetime of unspoken words between them. Then, slowly, Grandma reached out and pulled Marguerite into her arms. They held each other for what felt like an eternity, both of them crying softly. I turned away, feeling like an intruder in a moment that wasn't mine to witness. I wheeled myself back to the living room, where the shadows seemed to grow longer, stretching across the floor like tendrils. It wasn't long before I heard their voices, low and strained, coming from the kitchen. I didn't want to eavesdrop, but the house was small, and their words carried easily. "I never meant to leave you, Mother," Marguerite was saying. "But after what happened with Edward's father, I couldn't stay. I was so ashamed, so lost." Grandma's voice was soft but firm. "You left us, Marguerite. You left your son. Do you have any idea what that did to him? To me? I know," she sobbed. "I know I hurt you both, and I've regretted it every day. But I was so broken. I didn't know how to face you, how to face myself." There was a long silence, and I could hear the sound of the wind picking up outside, rattling the windows. The storm was coming. "I'm here now," Marguerite said, her voice barely audible. "I want to make things right." I wanted to believe her, but a part of me was still wary, still afraid to let her back into my heart. I didn't know if I could forgive her, didn't know if I wanted to. The rest of the night passed in a blur. Marguerite stayed with us, and we all did our best to pretend that things were normal. But the tension was palpable, and every word felt heavy, loaded with unspoken fears and regrets. As the storm finally broke, the rain pouring down in sheets, I lay awake in my room, listening to the sound of thunder rumbling in the distance. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something more than just the weather. And I was right. The days after Marguerite's return were tense, filled with hesitant conversations and awkward silences. It was clear that she wanted to reconnect, but the years of separation had created a chasm between us that seemed impossible to bridge. Grandma did her best to ease the tension, but even she struggled to find the right words. One evening, as the three of us sat around the dinner table, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken thoughts. The sound of the clock ticking in the background was the only thing breaking the silence. I could see the worry etched into Grandma's face, her eyes darting between me and Marguerite, as if she feared that at any moment, the fragile peace we'd established would shatter. Finally, Marguerite spoke. "Edward, there's something I need to tell you," she said, her voice trembling. I looked up from my plate, my heart pounding in my chest. "What is it?" She took a deep breath, as if gathering the courage to continue. "The night I left, I wasn't just running away from my mistakes. I was running because I was scared. Scared of what would happen if I stayed." "Scared of what?" I asked, confusion and anger mixing in my voice. She looked down at her hands, wringing them nervously. "Your father. He wasn't a good man. He was involved in things I didn't know about until it was too late. When I found out, I confronted him, and he threatened to hurt me." "To hurt you?" The room went cold, the air thick with tension. I could feel my pulse racing, my mind struggling to process her words. Why didn't you tell us? Grandma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marguerite shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I thought I could protect you by leaving. I thought if I disappeared, he'd lose interest, and you'd be safe. But I was wrong. He found me, and he's been keeping tabs on me ever since. That's why I stayed away. I didn't want to lead him back here. I felt a knot form in my stomach. The man who had abandoned us, the man who had left me with a body that would never be whole, he was still out there, still a threat. The thought made my blood run cold. Is he still after us? I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. Marguerite nodded, her face pale. I think so. That's why I came back. I couldn't stay away any longer. I had to be here, with you, to protect you both. The room fell silent, the weight of her confession hanging heavy in the air. I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to feel. Part of me wanted to rage at her for keeping this secret for so long, for leaving us to deal with the consequences of her choices. But another part of me, an older, wiser part, understood that she had done what she thought was best, even if it had been the wrong choice. We'll figure this out, Grandma said finally, her voice strong and steady. We'll protect each other, just like we always have. The days that followed were filled with planning and preparation. We installed new locks on the doors, made sure the windows were secure, and even arranged for a neighbor to check in on us regularly. The fear that had once lingered in the background now consumed our every thought, but we didn't let it paralyze us. We were determined to face whatever came our way, together. It wasn't long before our fears were realized. One evening, as the sun was setting and the shadows were lengthening, a knock came at the door. This time, it wasn't polite or hesitant, it was loud, demanding, a fist pounding against the wood. We all froze, the sound sending a jolt of fear through us. I saw the color drain from Marguerite's face, and I knew instantly who it was. Stay here, Grandma whispered, grabbing the rifle we'd kept near the door since the robbery. I'll handle this. But Marguerite shook her head, stepping forward. No, Mother. I have to face him. I have to end this. Before we could stop her, she opened the door. Standing there, in the dim light of the porch, was a man I'd only seen in old photographs. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a face that had once been handsome but was now hardened by years of bitterness. His eyes, cold and calculating, locked onto Marguerite. Hello, Marguerite, he said, his voice smooth and menacing. You've been a very hard woman to find. She stood her ground, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. What do you want, Richard? He smiled, a cold, cruel smile that sent a shiver down my spine. What I've always wanted. You, back under my control. And if you won't come willingly, I'll take what's mine. I could see the fear in Marguerite's eyes, but she didn't back down. You're not taking anything from me. Not anymore. He took a step forward, his hand reaching for her. But before he could touch her, Grandma raised the rifle, her hand steady despite her age. Get off my property, she said, her voice firm. You're not welcome here. For a moment, Richard hesitated, his eyes flicking between the rifle and Marguerite. Then he smirked, as if the sight of an old woman with a gun was nothing more than an inconvenience. But he didn't count on the resolve in her voice, the years of hardship and love that had forged her into the woman she was. She wasn't just protecting her daughter, she was protecting her family, her home, everything she held dear. This isn't over, Richard spat, his eyes narrowing. I'll be back. Not if I have anything to say about it, Grandma replied, her finger hovering over the trigger. With one last glare, Richard turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. We stood there for a long time, the tension slowly draining from the room. When the danger had finally passed, Marguerite collapsed into Grandma's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. We'd faced a threat greater than any we'd ever known, and we'd come out the other side, stronger for it. The past had finally caught up with us, but it hadn't broken us. If anything, it had brought us closer together. In the weeks that followed, we began to rebuild. Marguerite stayed with us, slowly healing from the wounds of her past. She and Grandma spent hours talking, mending the rift that had once divided them. And though I still had my doubts, I began to see her as more than just the woman who had left me behind. She was my mother, flawed and human, but willing to fight for the family she had once abandoned. As the days turned into weeks, the memory of Richard's visit began to fade. The fear that had once gripped us loosened its hold, replaced by a sense of peace. We knew he might return, but we were ready for him. We were ready for anything. And in the end, it wasn't the threat of danger that defined us, it was our love for each other, our determination to protect what mattered most. We were a family, united by more than just blood, and nothing could tear us apart. The farmhouse, once a place of quiet solitude, was now filled with laughter, warmth, and hope. We'd faced our darkest fears and come out stronger, and though the road ahead was uncertain, we knew we could face it together. And as I sat by the window one evening, watching the sun set over the fields, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. The world was still turning, life was still moving forward, and for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of what tomorrow might bring. Because no matter what happened, I knew we'd face it together. And that was all I needed. If you liked this story, please subscribe, like, click the bell, and leave a comment. Thank you in advance.